Welcome, everyone, to Unit 7, Lesson 4. Today, we'll be talking about the end to the American Civil War and the impact that it would have on the country and its aftermath. For your essential idea, we're going to be talking about how the Civil War is going to end in a Union victory and how it's going to impact the future of the United States, setting up the time period of American history, too. For your essential question, you're going to be determining what those major impacts of the American Civil War were. Before we get into the final battles, I do want to talk about the war atrocities that are going to occur. There will be crimes against humanity that occur during the American Civil War. And while they will technically occur on both sides, the vast majority of the worst war crimes will occur in the South. We're going to focus on two of those. The first is going to be known as the Massacre at Fort Pillow. You're going to have Confederate troops capture a Union fort that contained black soldiers. Many of the Confederates fighting are going to see black Union soldiers as stolen property, as runaway slaves that chose to join. And after this, you're going to end up having 300 of these soldiers killed rather than be treated as prisoners of war. The man that was in charge of the Confederates at that time is going to be a man by the name of Nathan Bedford Forrest. He is going to end up later in time creating a terrorist organization known as the Ku Klux Klan or the KKK. The second thing that we're going to see is Andersonville Prison, a Confederate war prison that held up to 45,000 Union prisoners. The problem with this prison was that it was overfilled and did not have enough supplies like food and water to keep the prisoners healthy. Over 13,000 of the prisoners that were there would die of starvation and disease, nearly a third of all prisoners that went to that one prison. Going back to the war effort, we're going to see the conclusion of the Western Theater in Sherman's March to the Sea. He is going to end up leading his troops through all of Georgia, across South Carolina, and into North Carolina, where he will end up getting the surrender of the Western Theater Confederates in Raleigh. After Sherman's success in taking Tennessee, he would turn his attention to the major city of Atlanta, a vital railroad hub for Southern trade and one of the last major cities standing in the South. He would end up capturing and burning over a third of that city, beginning his concept of total warfare. Following that capture of Atlanta in September of 1864, only 2 months before the presidential election, you're going to have the new approach be Sherman's march to Savannah, Georgia, in the Atlantic Ocean. Throughout this march, he is going to use that concept of total warfare, unrestricted fighting and destruction, not limited just to the war effort, but also citizens. His men will destroy factories, farms, homes. They will kill livestock just to take away a food source for anybody living in the South. Will burn fields of cotton and wheat, destroy roads and railroads that get in their way. This path will go over 200 miles long and will be 60 miles wide. To take that into perspective, 60 miles in a straight line from Tarboro is Raleigh. Imagine a line that long for 200 miles of near complete destruction along that entire line. After he reaches Savannah and takes that city right before Christmas, he'll turn his attention on to South Carolina and would destroy 12 cities throughout that path. Now, in all, the significance of the March to the Sea is going to help boost Northern morale. They can see the end of the war in sight. Really, only one major city, Richmond, was left. And you already had that nearby siege at Petersburg for Grant. This is going to completely divide the South again. While we already saw the taking of the Mississippi River cut the South in half, this will now cut them into thirds, with the southern part and the Carolinas and Virginia in the North. All of the major fighting that will take place will only be in Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina to conclude the war, meaning that you have the South boxed into a corner. The final thing that's important to understand is that total warfare is going to have a massive impact on the South for time to come. It will break the Confederate will to keep fighting, but will also break the South, meaning that they are going to need to have help in rebuilding after the war. Thanks to the victories that we see under Grant and Sherman in the election of 1864, which potentially led to a failure of Lincoln to win re-election, you're going to end up having Lincoln and the Union stay in the war through Lincoln being reelected as president. Prior to the success of the Wilderness Campaign and the taking of Atlanta, many people thought that Lincoln would lose. He was massively unpopular, and the person that he's running against was popular in the public eye. That person was George McClellan, the first general of the Union Army, and a man that was fired for being too cautious. Lincoln wanted the war to be finished and have slavery ended everywhere. Meanwhile, McClellan wanted to end the war as soon as possible and may have let the Confederacy be independent or keep slavery after rejoining. Sherman's capture of Atlanta, however, was the turning point, as Northerners saw the war as winnable, and they would push to re-elect Lincoln. The significance of this is that now the war with the Confederacy is not going to end until the Confederate Army surrenders. Lincoln is going to seek that re-election as well as a mandate to end slavery everywhere. Following this election, he will begin the push for the 13th Amendment, which will abolish slavery in the entirety of the United States. The final battle for us to look at is the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse out in Virginia. This is not just going to result in a Union victory, but will be where Robert E. Lee and the Confederates will surrender and end the war. To get there, you will end up having the city of Petersburg fall and the city of Richmond abandoned by the Confederates. Lee is forced to retreat, and the capital city of the South will be burned as they retreat. A stark image for what happened throughout the Confederacy in the time leading up. As we look at the damage to the capital city, you understand the morale of the South to be incredibly low. They realize that the war is effectively over. And in short time, the war will be over. Lee's attempt to escape was cut off at Appomattox Courthouse, and there he will decide to surrender to Grant. Although many people had called for unconditional surrender, and that was something that Grant was known for, he was particularly generous in the surrender. He let the Confederates return home to take care of their families under no charges of treason. That's a crime that carries the death penalty in pretty much every situation. But by letting them go, he's attempting to have the comeback of the South into the Union to be better and not have as many hard feelings. With the significance of this, the war is effectively over. In the days that follow, you're going to have Johnston's Confederate forces surrender to Sherman in Raleigh. With this, the Union has won and the United States is preserved. And with those terms of surrender that we saw, we're going to see a desire to reconcile with the South quickly. That is not going to be held by everybody in the North. As you look at this map, you will see in the land gained by the Union throughout this war. It was very slow at the beginning, but by the time we end up getting into 1863 and 1864, you will see the tide of the war quickly shifting. As the war ends in 1865 and the South has fallen, we now have to get to how do we bring the South back? Before we talk about Reconstruction, which we'll pick up on next week, It's important to understand the total impacts of the Civil War. The first major impact was the first original goal of Abraham Lincoln to preserve the Union. By stopping the South from seceding and reuniting the states, we once again have a united country, although not necessarily united in their mindset. You're also going to see, once again, the supremacy of the federal power being shown. The federal government has shown that it is superior over the states. Nullification and secession are no longer going to be major issues within the country. Occasionally, you'll get a state that says they want to secede. Mainly Texas has done this several times, but nothing's ever come about from it, and there has been no need to forcibly stop them. One thing that the federal government tries to push in their success and supremacy is going to be laws that would end up helping the North and the West, as well as blacks, but would not help the South. To benefit the North, you're going to get the Morrill Tariff Act, which is a high protective tariff that funds the Union Army and Northern business from competition and will stay on as we get into the time period of Reconstruction. This will again, like almost every tariff we've seen before, hurt the South. You will also get 3 laws that benefit the West. The Homestead Act is going to give cheap land out in the Midwestern states, a total of 160 acres of land for just $10, meaning that many people can now travel and have large farms out in the Midwest of the country. The Morrill Land Grant Act is also going to provide new land for colleges, particularly agricultural and technical colleges out in the West. This will provide the skills that are necessary for people to be able to survive in the Midwest. These skills would include the ability to farm on that rough territory. And the last one will be the Pacific Railway Act, which will officially authorize the building of a transcontinental. That route will end up going in the north, once again benefiting northern businesses. The other way that the federal government shows their supremacy in aiding blacks is going to be through the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment will officially abolish slavery nationwide, including the border states that did not have slavery end in the Emancipation Proclamation. Once slaves can be freed, you now give blacks citizenship and equality under the law. That concept of equality under law is going to be very difficult, however, and will face many problems, as we'll soon see. Once the freed slaves become citizens, they would get the 15th Amendment, which will establish black suffrage for all black men over the age of 21. The third major impact that we're going to see is the growth of industry. As the war ends up helping the northern economy, you're going to have federal policies aiding industry and business growth after the war. All of this is going to culminate in another industrial revolution and the rise of big business. And with all of this, we will finally get into the electric age. The fourth impact that we see goes back to westward expansion. Now, manifest destiny is going to continue after the war, and we will look westward, leading to conflict with Native Americans, leading to the growth of the West, leading to a haven for Southerners who lost in the war, but also leading to conflict beyond the country's borders. The fifth impact that we're going to see is going to go back to that abolition of slavery. With this, starting with the Emancipation Proclamation and ending with the 13th Amendment, slavery would be ended everywhere in the United States. The fight for civil rights that we saw in the 14th and 15th Amendments that followed the 13th would end up becoming a major point throughout all of American history, too. And it would take nearly 100 years for civil rights to fully be affected as we go into the 1960s. The last point that we look at is that the South was devastated. The Anaconda Plan, total war, and the abolition of slavery and the loss of the workforce that was in the South means that the Southern economy and culture has been decimated. The next 10 years of American history would effectively be dedicated to trying to rebuild the South's minds and spirits. The problem is, it wouldn't work. As we end the Civil War, it's important to understand the toll that this had on our country. 620,000 Americans would die in the Civil War. As you compare that to each of the wars that's listed beneath that total, that only accounted for about 550,000. There were 70,000 more American deaths than the world wars, the Cold War conflicts, all of the previous American wars put together. And it happened because Americans were fighting Americans. With this, we see that the country has got a lot to do. We see that there's a lot that we have to build off of. And we will conclude this course as we go into Reconstruction next week. Thank you guys. I will see you then.